So imagine this. You go to sleep, you wake up, and you're 6 feet underground, completely dark, can't move, can't scream, nobody can hear you. Sounds like a horror movie, right? Except this actually happened. Not in some fictional story, not in a made-up tale to scare people at campfire. This happened in 1915 in South Carolina, and the woman who lived through it changed medicine forever. Her name was Essie Dunbar, and her story might be the most terrifying thing you'll hear all week. Listen, I know what you're thinking. People don't just wake up in coffins. That's movie stuff. That's dramatic, over-the-top Hollywood garbage. But the thing is, it wasn't. And the reason I'm telling you this story today is because what happened to Essie proves something absolutely terrifying about medicine back then, about death itself, about how thin the line actually is between being alive and being declared dead. Let me take you back to 1915, Blackville, South Carolina. It was summer, hot like you wouldn't believe, the kind of heat that makes the air shimmer off the ground, makes people move slower, makes everything feel heavy and exhausting. Essie Dunbar was living her regular life. She was 30 years old, not rich, not famous, just a woman living in a small town, doing what normal people do, waking up, working, living day to day. She had no idea that one afternoon would change absolutely everything. It happened on a normal day, the kind of day where nothing feels different, nothing seems special or dangerous. She was at home, probably doing chores or sitting on the porch trying to stay cool. Then it hit her, a wave of dizziness. Her head started spinning. The world around her began to blur. She felt weak, confused, like something was seriously wrong inside her body, something she couldn't explain or control. And she was right. Something was very wrong, but nobody knew it yet. Nobody understood what was about to happen. Her family got scared. Someone suggested calling the doctor. Back then, that was a serious thing. You didn't just casually call a doctor. Doctors were expensive. Doctors were authority figures. Doctors were people you called when someone was actually dying. So, the fact that they called Dr. D.C. Briggs meant Essie's family knew something was genuinely bad. Something was seriously wrong with her body. When Dr. Briggs arrived, he was the picture of confidence. He was known in town as someone who knew medicine, someone who'd seen everything, someone who could tell at a glance whether someone was sick or whether they were fine. He walked into that house like he already knew what he'd find. He looked at Essie. He checked her pulse. He looked in her eyes. He listened to her breathing. He did all the things a doctor would do. And after a few minutes, he straightened up. His face was serious, and he delivered the news that would haunt Essie's family for the rest of their lives. "She's dead," he said. Just like that. Flat. No emotion, no hope. Just a statement of medical fact. Essie Dunbar was dead, and there was nothing anyone could do about it. The family fell into devastation. Genuine, complete, total devastation. This wasn't just sickness. This wasn't something they could recover from. This was the end. This was death. And it had happened suddenly, without warning, without any time to prepare. But here's where the story gets interesting. Here's where things start to change. Essie's family made the arrangements. They prepared her body. They got the coffin ready. They sent out word that there would be a funeral. In those days, funerals happened fast. You died on one day, you got buried the next. That was just how it worked. There was no waiting, no extended mourning period, just quick, final goodbye. So Essie was prepared. She was dressed in a funeral gown. Her body was placed in a wooden coffin. Everything was arranged for the funeral to happen the next morning. But Essie had an older sister, and that sister was in another town. That sister didn't hear about the death until it was too late, until the funeral was already happening. She got in a carriage and rushed as fast as she could to get there, but she arrived just as they were lowering the coffin into the ground. She was too late to see her sister alive, too late to say goodbye, or so everyone thought. This older sister, she was devastated. She wasn't going to accept this. She wasn't going to just watch her sister get buried without getting one last look, one final moment. She basically demanded that they open the coffin. She needed to see her sister's face one more time before she was put in the ground forever. It was an unusual request. It wasn't normal. But the people there, the priests and the family, they understood her desperation. They understood she needed closure. So they made a decision that would change everything. They decided to dig up the coffin. The grave diggers got their shovels. They began working. Dirt was flying. The sun was beating down on them. And slowly, piece by piece, the coffin was being unearthed. People gathered around to watch. This was unusual. This was the kind of thing people talked about. The kind of thing that stayed in people's memories. There was something almost eerie about it. About digging up someone who'd just been buried. About reversing the finality of death. About saying, no, wait, not yet. The coffin was lifted out of the ground. It was covered in dirt. It was placed on the ground next to the open grave. And everyone gathered around. The priests were there. The family was there. The sister who demanded this was there. And everyone was quiet. Everyone was waiting for someone to open it. For someone to lift that lid and let her sister's face be seen one more time. One of the priests stepped forward. He reached down toward the coffin. His hands grabbed the wooden lid. And slowly, very slowly, he began to lift it open. The wood creaked. The hinges groaned. And inside that coffin, in the dim light, was the body of Essie Dunbar. Still, pale, wearing her death gown, looking exactly like a dead body should look, except she wasn't dead. And what happened next would change this small town forever. Essie's eyes opened. Just like that. Her eyes simply opened. She looked up at the sky, at the faces of the people staring down at her in absolute shock. And she sat up, slowly, like she was waking from a long sleep. She pushed herself up with her hands. She looked around at everyone gathered around this coffin. And then she smiled. Actually smiled. And that's when everybody lost their minds. One of the priests screamed. Actually screamed, like he'd seen a ghost. Because to him, to all of them, that's what this was. A ghost. A dead woman resurrecting herself right in front of them. The priest, who was standing closest to the coffin, literally fell backward. Fell right into the open grave they'd just dug. He broke his ribs when he hit the bottom. Just panicked completely and fell. People started running. People started screaming. This was before anyone understood medical science like we do today. This was a time when seeing something that defied explanation meant one thing. Something supernatural was happening. Something evil. Something impossible. The town had gathered for a funeral. And instead, they'd witnessed what they genuinely believed was the resurrection of the dead. Essie, covered in dirt, dressed in her funeral gown, tried to call out to them. "Wait!" she was screaming. "It's me! It's Essie! I'm alive! Please wait!" But nobody could hear her over their own panic. Nobody could process what was happening. She'd been declared dead by a doctor. She'd been buried. And now she was sitting up in her own coffin. That was not something anyone was equipped to handle. She stumbled out of the coffin. She tried to walk toward her family, but people were running away from her. They were crossing themselves. They were whispering prayers. Some people actually thought she was a demon, that Essie had been possessed, that something evil had animated her dead body and brought it back to the surface. The fear was real. The terror was complete. Essie walked through the town, alone, in her funeral gown, covered in grave dirt. And everywhere she went, people scattered, people hid, children were pulled away from her. She was a living nightmare brought to life. She was impossible. She was something that shattered everything people believed about death and medicine. But the question that everyone asked was simple. How? How was this possible? How did a dead woman come back to life? How did she survive being buried in a coffin underground? What actually happened to Essie Dunbar? The answer lies in something called catalepsy. It's a condition where your body goes into a state that looks like death but isn't. It's extremely rare. It was even more common back in 1915 because doctors didn't understand it. They didn't have the tools to detect it. They didn't have machines that could show them exactly what was happening inside a person's body. When Essie had that seizure, when she collapsed on that summer day, her body didn't just stop moving. It went into something much deeper, much more serious. Her heart rate dropped dramatically. We're talking about just a few beats per minute. Her breathing slowed down so much that it was barely visible. To an untrained eye, to a doctor in 1915 without proper equipment, she appeared completely dead. No pulse, no breathing, nothing. But here's the thing. She was conscious. Somewhere deep in her own mind, locked inside her unresponsive body, Essie was aware. She could hear voices. She could sense movement around her. But she couldn't move. She couldn't speak. She couldn't do anything to communicate that she was still in there, trapped in her own body, terrified, confused, but alive. When they lowered her into the ground, when they closed that coffin, when they covered it with dirt, Essie was trapped in complete darkness, complete silence. Her mind was racing. She could hear the sounds of the burial happening above her, the dirt being shoveled, the prayers being said, the finality of it all. But she couldn't move. She couldn't scream. She couldn't do anything except exist in that terrifying state. For 48 hours, Essie Dunbar lay in that coffin. 2 full days. 48 hours of absolute psychological torture. 48 hours of being conscious, but completely paralyzed. 48 hours of darkness, of suffocation, of terror beyond what most of us can imagine. Her body, in that state of catalepsy, was using almost no oxygen, maybe 1 or 2% of what a normal waking person would use. Her metabolism had basically shut down. Her body had gone into something like hibernation. That's the only reason she didn't run out of air. That's the only reason she didn't simply suffocate. But mentally, emotionally, that was a completely different story. Those 48 hours were the most traumatic, the most horrifying, the most absolutely soul-crushing hours of Essie's life. She was aware, she was conscious, she was trapped, and there was absolutely nothing she could do about it. Then, just when she thought it couldn't get worse, she heard the sound of shovels, the sound of her coffin being dug up, the sound of the lid being opened, light, actual light, for the first time in 2 days, and faces, shocked, terrified faces staring down at her. When she opened her eyes, when she sat up, when she climbed out of that coffin, she wasn't just returning to life. She was returning to a life that would never be the same. She was returning to a world that was now terrified of her, that saw her as something unnatural, something impossible, something that shouldn't exist. That's the first part of Essie's story, but it's far from the end, because after she escaped that coffin, after she walked through a town that was convinced she was some kind of supernatural being, Essie had to figure out how to live, how to move forward, how to rebuild a life after being declared dead. And that's where things get even more interesting. That's where this story shifts from being about a medical mystery to being about human resilience, about trauma, about survival, about what happens to a person who's been through something so absolutely devastating that most people wouldn't survive it psychologically. So stay with me, because Essie's story gets deeper, it gets darker, and it gets more important, because what happened to her after she climbed out of that coffin reveals something profound about the human spirit. Essie didn't go home after climbing out of that coffin. Think about that for a second. She just experienced the most traumatic thing a human being could possibly go through. She'd been buried alive. She'd been conscious in complete darkness for 48 hours. And when she finally escaped, when she finally saw light again, the people she thought would comfort her ran away screaming. Her family was split. Part of them were relieved that she was alive. Part of them were terrified of her. And the rest of them weren't really sure what to feel. How do you react when someone you've buried comes back? When someone you've already mourned suddenly walks out of a grave? It doesn't fit into any normal category of human experience. There's no protocol for this. There's no guidebook that tells you how to handle it. So Essie basically had to fend for herself. She had to figure out on her own how to cope with what had happened, how to deal with the fact that her own doctor had declared her dead, how to deal with the fact that an entire town now thought she was something supernatural, how to deal with the psychological trauma of being trapped in a coffin for 48 hours. The panic didn't stop at the cemetery. That's the thing people don't really understand about living in a small town. Everything spreads. Everything becomes common knowledge. By the next day, everybody in Blackville knew what had happened. By the day after that, people in neighboring towns had heard about it. By the end of the week, newspapers were picking up the story. This woman who'd come back from the dead. This impossible thing that had happened in South Carolina. Some people thought it was a miracle. Some people thought it was demonic. Some people thought it was a hoax. But everyone had an opinion. And everyone was talking about Essie. She went from being a regular woman who lived her regular life to being the most famous person in the entire region. And she didn't want any of it. She never asked for this attention. She never asked to become a spectacle. There's something actually cruel about sudden fame like that, especially when that fame is built on fear. People would come from other towns just to see her, just to look at her. They'd want to touch her sometimes. They'd want to verify that she was actually real, that she was actually alive. Some people thought that being touched by her might bring them good luck. Other people thought that being near her might curse them. Essie's life became completely impossible. She couldn't go to the store without people pointing at her. She couldn't go to church without people whispering behind their hands. She couldn't do anything that a normal person does without being reminded that she was different, that she was other, that she was the woman who came back from the dead. This went on for months, then for years, for decades actually, because Essie lived a long time after that. She lived 47 more years, almost 5 decades living with the shadow of that coffin hanging over her. 5 decades of being defined by something that happened to her for 2 days. But here's what's important about Essie's story. Here's what makes it more than just a medical curiosity. After she came out of that coffin, after she survived the initial panic and terror, she started asking questions. She started trying to understand what had happened to her. She started researching. She started reading. She started learning about medicine, about her own body, about catalepsy. And she wasn't alone in this, because what happened to Essie wasn't actually unique. There were other cases, not many, but enough that doctors and medical researchers had started keeping records. Enough that a pattern was starting to emerge. A pattern that suggested people were being buried alive more often than anyone wanted to admit. There was a woman named Janet Philomel in France. It was back in 1867. She'd had cholera. She got very sick. Her family thought she was dead. They put her in a coffin. They buried her. But the gravedigger heard something that night. He heard knocking. Knocking from inside the coffin, from underneath the ground. He heard a human voice calling for help. They dug her up immediately. They opened the coffin. And Janet was alive. She was conscious. She was terrified. She was clawing at the inside of the coffin. Her fingernails were broken and bleeding from trying to get out. Can you imagine that? Actually being buried alive and trying to claw your way out of a coffin? Trying to dig through solid wood with just your fingernails? But here's the tragic part. By the time they got her out, it was too late. The cholera had done its damage. Janet lived for a few more days, but she died from the disease that everyone thought had already killed her. So she survived being buried alive only to die from the very sickness they'd thought was going to kill her all along. Then there was Arabella Tetley, England, 1888. She had a condition called catalepsy too. At least that's what we'd call it today. She went into what looked like death, completely unresponsive, no detectable pulse, no visible breathing. A doctor declared her dead. They put her in a coffin. They were about to bury her. But Arabella's husband, he had a feeling. He wasn't convinced. He didn't believe that she was actually dead. He was insistent enough that they agreed to do the burial at the family's house first, rather than immediately taking the coffin to the cemetery. And while they were preparing everything, while family members were gathered around paying respects, Arabella woke up. She woke up inside the coffin, just like Essie did. She started moving. She started making noise. People heard her. They opened the coffin. And she was alive. Completely alive. Conscious. Terrified. But alive. Arabella didn't have the same media coverage that Essie did. She didn't become as famous. But her story circulated in medical circles. It became part of the growing body of evidence that suggested something was wrong with how doctors were diagnosing death. That the line between life and death wasn't as clear-cut as everyone assumed. Because here's the thing about death back then. There was no standard. There were no machines that could tell you definitively whether someone was dead or alive. A doctor would check for a pulse. He'd listen for a heartbeat. He'd observe breathing. If he couldn't detect any of those things, that person was declared dead. Period. End of story. But what he couldn't see were the tiny, barely detectable movements that someone in catalepsy might be making. The minimal heart rate that might be going on inside a body that appeared completely still. So there was this growing crisis in the medical world. Because how many people had been buried alive? How many people had been declared dead when they were actually just in this cataleptic state? How many people had suffocated in coffins while their families mourned above ground? Nobody knew. But the number was enough to start a movement to prevent premature burial. Some doctors started experimenting. Some of them developed tests. One doctor in Germany came up with a way to try to detect any signs of life. He would do things like apply heat to the body, or pull a string attached to a bell that was placed on top of the coffin. The idea was that if the person woke up, they could ring the bell, they could signal for help. That's where the idea of safety coffins came from. Starting in the 1800s, coffin makers started building coffins with bells on top. Coffins with air tubes. Coffins designed to give someone buried alive a chance to signal for help. Some of them even had mirrors so that if someone was conscious inside, they could look up and see if there was any light coming through cracks in the coffin. These safety coffins were incredibly popular. People paid extra money specifically to be buried in coffins that might give them a chance to escape if they woke up in the ground. And this is where Essie's story becomes really interesting. Because Essie lived through this. She was buried in a regular wooden coffin. No bells, no air tubes, nothing designed to help someone who might wake up. But she survived anyway. And that survival, that impossible survival, made her think about what could have been done differently. Essie wasn't a medical researcher. She wasn't a scientist. She was just a woman who'd been through something terrifying and came out the other side. But she had first-hand knowledge of what it was like to be trapped, to be buried alive, to have no way to communicate that she was conscious. And she started advocating. She started talking to anyone who would listen. She started telling her story. She gave interviews, she talked to newspapers, she corresponded with doctors and researchers who were interested in her case. She became, in a way, a voice for everyone who'd experienced premature burial. A voice for everyone who'd survived being declared dead. And through her advocacy, through her willingness to relive that trauma over and over again by telling her story, Essie contributed to the medical understanding of catalepsy. She contributed to doctors learning to be more careful about declaring someone dead. She contributed to the recognition that the line between life and death was more complicated than anyone had previously understood. But the toll that this took on her personally was enormous. Essie never fully recovered from what happened to her. She had nightmares. She had panic attacks. She developed extreme anxiety, especially in closed spaces. She couldn't stand darkness. She couldn't stand being confined. She couldn't stand being touched without warning. All of these symptoms, they're what we would call PTSD today, post-traumatic stress disorder. But back in the early 1900s, there was no name for it. There was no understanding of it. There was just Essie, struggling with psychological damage that nobody could explain or help her with. She went on to live until 1962, she made it to 77 years old, which means she lived 47 years after that coffin. 47 years of living with the memory of those 48 hours. 47 years of being the woman who came back from the dead. 47 years of trying to rebuild a life that had been completely shattered. And here's what's remarkable about that. Here's what actually shows the strength of the human spirit. Despite everything she went through, despite the trauma and the terror and the psychological damage, Essie didn't retreat completely from life. She didn't become a hermit. She didn't give up. She engaged with her community. She had relationships. She worked. She lived. She participated in the world even though the world had terrified her and rejected her. That's not nothing. That's actually extraordinary. That's a testament to human resilience. That's proof that people can survive things that should probably destroy them. That people can come back from trauma. That people can rebuild. That people can move forward even when everything tells them they should give up. But Essie's story also raises some really important questions. Questions that we should think about today. Because what happened to Essie wasn't really an isolated incident. It was part of a much larger pattern. A pattern of medical mistakes. A pattern of doctors being wrong about death. A pattern of people being declared dead when they were actually alive. Today, we have machines. We have technology. We have electrocardiographs that can detect even the faintest heartbeat. We have EEGs that can show activity in the brain. We have pulse oximeters that can measure oxygen levels. We have all kinds of equipment that makes it virtually impossible to mistake a living person for a dead one, in theory. But even today, even with all our technology, there are still cases. There are still people who've been declared brain dead and then showed signs of consciousness weeks or months later. There are still cases of people waking up during surgery. There are still medical mistakes that slip through. The technology has gotten better, but the human element is still there. Doctors still make mistakes. Machines still malfunction. And sometimes the line between life and death is still not as clear as we think it is. Essie's story reminds us of that. It reminds us that we should never be completely certain about anything. That we should always maintain a little bit of humility about what we know and don't know. That the human body is capable of things that seem impossible. That survival is more complicated than we understand. That trauma can be overcome. And it reminds us of something else too. It reminds us that the people who come back, the people who survive impossible situations, they have something important to teach us. They have stories that matter. They have experiences that can help us understand ourselves and our world better. Essie Dunbar's story mattered. It mattered when it was happening. It mattered for the rest of her life. And it still matters today. Because it's a story about survival, about resilience, about the power of the human spirit to endure unimaginable things. By the time Essie was in her 50s, the initial shock had worn off. People had moved on. There were new scandals, new stories, new things to talk about. Essie became just another person in her town, just a woman living her life. But she never forgot what happened to her. She never forgot those 48 hours in the coffin. She never forgot the feeling of being trapped, being paralyzed, being unable to communicate with the people she loved. But she also didn't let it destroy her. She didn't let it be the only thing that defined her. She was Essie Dunbar, the woman who came back from the dead. But she was also Essie Dunbar, the woman who went to work every day, who had relationships, who was part of her community, who laughed and loved and experienced all the normal human emotions despite having been through something abnormal. That's the real story here. Not just the medical miracle, not just the incredible survival, but the everyday resilience of a human being who went through hell and chose to keep living. Now let's talk about what's really important here, because Essie's story isn't just a historical curiosity. It's not just something we can look back on and feel grateful that modern medicine has improved. It's something that should make us think about what we actually know about death, about consciousness, about the human body, and how much we still don't understand. See, when Essie emerged from that coffin, when she climbed out and faced a town that believed she was something impossible, something supernatural, she became living proof of something radical. She became proof that death isn't always what we think it is, that the moment between life and death isn't always a clear-cut line. That consciousness can exist in states we don't fully understand, states that our technology and our training might miss entirely. The medical community had to reckon with this. They had to face the fact that they had been wrong, that a trained physician, someone who had the education and the authority to make life and death decisions, had made a fundamental mistake. He had looked at Essie and declared her dead when she was actually alive. He had condemned her to be buried, and he had only been stopped by the desperate request of a sister, by a moment of family grief that led to an unusual decision. If that sister hadn't come late, if she hadn't demanded to see Essie one more time, if someone else had made those choices, Essie would have suffocated in that coffin. The realization of how close she came to actually dying, to actually suffering in the ground for hours until her body gave out, that shook people. That made the medical establishment start asking harder questions. How many other people had this happened to? How many other cases were there where someone had been buried prematurely? How many families were out there mourning someone who might actually have still been alive? Medical journals started publishing papers about premature burial. Doctors started debating about new diagnostic methods. There were conferences. There were serious discussions about what constituted death, about whether a simple check for a pulse was really sufficient, about whether more rigorous testing should be done before someone was pronounced dead. One of the outcomes was what we talked about earlier, the safety coffins. But beyond that, there was a growing recognition that death as a medical diagnosis needed to be taken more seriously, that declaring someone dead was a huge responsibility, that mistakes could have devastating consequences, that the line between life and death needed to be treated with more caution. But here's what's fascinating. Essie's case also highlighted something that doctors and scientists still struggle with today: the question of consciousness during states that appear to be unconsciousness. If Essie was conscious in that coffin, if she could hear sounds and sense movement around her, what does that tell us about the nature of consciousness itself? What does it tell us about how the brain works during extreme stress or catalepsy? The honest answer is, we still don't completely know. We have better tools now. We have brain imaging. We have electrodes that can measure neural activity. We have ways of communicating with people who appear to be completely unresponsive. But there are still cases of locked-in syndrome. There are still people whose brains show activity, but whose bodies give no response. There are still mysteries about consciousness that we haven't fully solved. Essie's experience was a window into that mystery. It was evidence that the human body could do things that seemed to defy explanation, that consciousness could exist in strange states, that the assumption that no detectable physical response meant no consciousness was potentially wrong, that we needed to be more careful about our assumptions. And that brings us to another aspect of Essie's story that's really important: the psychological impact. What Essie experienced wasn't just a physical trauma. It was a psychological devastation, being locked in your own body for 48 hours, being aware but unable to move or speak. That's a form of psychological torture that most of us can't even imagine. Essie developed what we would now recognize as PTSD. But back in her time, there was no recognition of this. There was no language for it. There was no therapeutic framework to help her deal with it. She just had to suffer through it. She had to carry that trauma for 47 years until she died. Every nightmare, every panic attack, every moment of claustrophobia or anxiety, she had to carry all of that because her society didn't have the tools to help her process what had happened. If Essie were alive today, we would put her in therapy. We would have mental health professionals working with her to help her process the trauma. We would have medications that could help with anxiety. We would have a whole infrastructure designed to support someone who'd been through something like that. But Essie didn't have any of that. She just had herself and her family and a town that was as traumatized by what had happened as she was. And yet she went on. She moved forward. She built a life despite everything. She became part of her community again. She became not just the woman who came back from the dead, but a full human being with a full life. That's remarkable. That's actually one of the most impressive things about her story. There's another case we should mention. Another piece of the puzzle that makes Essie's experience less unique and more part of a pattern. Her name was Anna Margita. She lived in Germany. It was 1705. So this was even earlier than Essie, before modern medicine, before any of the technology we had by Essie's time. Anna went into a state that looked like death. She was pale, she was cold, she didn't respond to stimuli. The doctors declared her dead. She was placed in a coffin. She was being carried to her burial. And according to the historical record, at the moment the coffin was being lowered into the grave, Anna woke up. She started moving around inside the coffin. She started making noise. Someone heard her. They stopped the burial. They opened the coffin. And Anna was alive, conscious, confused, but alive. She lived for several more years after that. She got married. She had a child. She lived a relatively normal life by the standards of her time. But like Essie, she carried that trauma. She carried the memory of what it felt like to wake up in a coffin. These cases, they start to paint a picture. They suggest that this wasn't just a freak accident that happened to Essie. They suggest that this was a real problem in medical history, that there were multiple people who experienced premature burial, multiple people who went through that unimaginable horror, multiple families who accidentally orchestrated the torture of their loved ones. The question becomes why? Why did this happen so many times? Why were doctors so consistently wrong about death? The answer is actually pretty straightforward when you think about it. Back then, they didn't have the tools. There were no machines. There were no blood tests. There were no ways to measure oxygen levels or brain activity. A doctor would check for a pulse. He might listen to the chest with a stethoscope if he had one. He might look at the eyes. He might observe the skin color. But all of these things were subjective. All of these things could be interpreted incorrectly. A very weak pulse could be missed. Minimal breathing could be overlooked. Pallor could be the result of catalepsy rather than death. And there was also the factor of time pressure. In those days, death had to be dealt with quickly. Bodies had to be buried fast. If there was any doubt at all, the safe choice was to assume death had occurred and move forward. Because leaving a potentially dead body lying around in the heat wasn't an option. So the bias was toward declaring death quickly, toward moving forward, toward assuming the worst. But that bias came at a cost. That bias meant people got buried alive. That bias meant families made mistakes that they would regret forever. That bias meant that people like Essie had to suffer through the most horrifying experience imaginable, because the medical system of the time was fundamentally flawed. Today, we have different problems. Today, we have the opposite problem in some cases. We have the ability to keep bodies technically alive even when there's no consciousness. We have machines that can breathe for someone. We have machines that can keep a heart beating. We have the technology to maintain biological functions indefinitely. And that creates its own ethical nightmare, its own set of impossible decisions. But at least today, we have the ability to know. We can test for brain activity. We can determine with relative certainty whether consciousness exists. We can make informed decisions based on actual data, rather than just checking for a pulse and hoping we're right. We've moved forward from Essie's time. We've made progress. And some of that progress, some of that advancement in medical knowledge, came directly because of cases like Essie's. Because of the medical crisis that was forced upon the profession when it became clear that premature burial was a real problem. The recognition of catalepsy as a medical condition. The development of better diagnostic tools. The establishment of protocols for declaring death. All of these came partly because people like Essie survived and told their stories. So, in a way, Essie's suffering wasn't completely meaningless. Her trauma contributed to medical knowledge. Her experience helped establish safety measures that potentially saved other people's lives. The safety coffins that came into use. The protocols about who gets to declare someone dead. The growing awareness that death was more complicated than we thought. All of this came from cases like hers. But that doesn't erase the suffering. That doesn't make what happened to her okay. That doesn't somehow make up for 47 years of trauma. You can't really balance out someone's suffering by saying it led to medical progress. The suffering is still real. The person who suffered is still damaged. The trauma is still there. This is something important to understand about real-world stories, about how history actually works. Often, progress comes through suffering. Often, the way we learn is through mistakes that harm real people. That's not justice. That's just the reality of how humanity progresses. And it's something we should keep in mind. Every piece of medical knowledge, every protocol, every safety measure came at the cost of someone's suffering, came at the cost of someone being hurt, came at the cost of someone's tragedy. Essie Dunbar died in 1962. She made it to 77 years old. By all accounts, she lived a reasonably full life. She had family. She had a place in her community. She had made peace with what happened to her, or at least as much peace as anyone could make with something like that. But she never forgot. She spent decades telling her story. She spent decades being the woman who came back from the dead. She spent decades carrying the memory of that coffin. And her story has lived on beyond her. It's been told and retold. It's been written about. It's been discussed in medical circles. It's been used to illustrate points about the dangers of premature burial. It's been used to show how resilient humans can be. It's been used to demonstrate how wrong we can be about death. Her story has become part of the historical record, part of the collective memory of humanity. But what's important to understand is that Essie's story isn't unique in the way that history remembers it. It wasn't a completely anomalous event that happened once and then never again. It was part of a pattern. There were other cases, many other cases. Essie's was just one of the ones that got documented, one of the ones that got remembered, one of the ones that got passed down. How many other people experienced premature burial and will never know about them? How many other families had the horror of discovering they'd buried someone alive? How many other cases were there where someone woke up in a coffin and nobody was there to hear them? Nobody was there to save them. We don't know. The historical record is incomplete. But we know it happened. We know from the cases we do have. From Anna Margita, from Janet Philomel, from Arabella Tetley, from Essie Dunbar, and from dozens of other documented cases. We know that this was a real phenomenon, that this was a real danger in the centuries before modern medicine. So, when we think about Essie's story, when we really sit with it and understand what it means, we have to confront some uncomfortable truths. We have to confront the fact that human error is real, that our authority figures can be wrong, that doctors, for all their training and expertise, can make devastating mistakes. We have to confront the fact that consciousness is strange, that it can exist in states that appear to be unconscious, that we don't fully understand how the human mind works or how it manifests. And we have to confront the fact that trauma is real, that people can survive things that should destroy them, that resilience is possible, that moving forward after horror is possible, though it's incredibly difficult, that humans have an amazing capacity to endure and to keep living even after experiencing things that most of us would think were unbearable. Essie's legacy is complicated. She's become a symbol of premature burial, a symbol of medical error, but she's also become a symbol of survival, of resilience, of the power of the human spirit to keep going despite everything. Her story continues to matter because it touches on all of these things, because it's a real human story with real consequences. And here's the thing that makes it truly important. Essie's story should make us think about our own assumptions, about what we think we know, about where we might be wrong. Because if brilliant doctors in 1915 South Carolina could make such a fundamental mistake about something as basic as whether someone was alive or dead, what mistakes might we be making today? Where might our assumptions be leading us astray? What conventional wisdom do we accept without questioning that might be wrong? That's the real gift that Essie's story gives us. It's not just a fascinating historical narrative. It's not just a tale of medical horror and human resilience. It's a reminder to stay humble, to question authority, to recognize that our knowledge is incomplete, to understand that the human body and the human mind still have mysteries we haven't solved, to accept that we should always be willing to reconsider what we think we know. When you look back at Essie's life, when you really think about what she went through, you realize something profound. You realize that she was ordinary. She wasn't a scientist or a philosopher or someone famous. She was just a woman living her life in a small town in South Carolina. She had the misfortune of having a seizure at the wrong time. She had the incredible misfortune of being examined by a doctor who didn't have the tools to detect that she was still alive. She had the unimaginable misfortune of being buried. But then, she had the extraordinary fortune of having a sister who insisted on seeing her one more time, of having people nearby who heard her, of being rescued before she suffocated. And she had the incredible strength to survive what came after, to carry the trauma, to rebuild her life, to become a voice for others, to contribute to medical knowledge and safety protocols that would help others avoid her fate. That's a human story. That's a story about an ordinary person who endured something extraordinary and came out the other side not completely broken, but changed, marked, but still here, still fighting, still living. Because that's what humans do. We survive. We adapt. We move forward, even when moving forward seems impossible. So, the next time you think about Essie's story, the next time you hear about premature burial or catalepsy or medical error, remember this. Remember that behind every historical case, behind every medical textbook example, there's a real human being, a real person who suffered, a real person who survived, a real person who deserved to have their suffering mean something. Essie Dunbar was buried alive in 1915. She woke up in her coffin. She climbed out. And she lived. She lived for 47 more years. She lived with the trauma. She lived with the fear. She lived with the memories. But she lived. And her story continues to live. It continues to matter. It continues to teach us something important about who we are, about what we can survive, about how little we actually know about death and consciousness and the mysteries of the human body. What would you do if you woke up in a coffin? If you found yourself in complete darkness, unable to move, unable to speak, but completely conscious of what was happening, would you have the strength that Essie had? Would you be able to keep going the way she did? What would go through your mind? What would you think about? These are the questions that Essie's story forces us to ask. These are the questions that make her story matter, not just as a historical curiosity, but as a profound reflection on what it means to be human, on what we're capable of, on how we respond when everything goes wrong. And if you've ever wondered what the difference is between being alive and being dead, between being conscious and being unconscious, between surviving trauma and being destroyed by it, Essie's story has something to teach you. It's a story about boundaries, about how they're not as clear as we think, about how fragile life really is, about how remarkable it is that we're here at all. Essie Dunbar's story doesn't have a simple ending. There's no neat moral. There's no way to tie it up with a bow and say everything is resolved. She lived with the consequences of premature burial for her entire life. She never fully recovered from what happened to her. The trauma stayed with her. The fear stayed with her. The memory of that coffin, of that darkness, of that paralysis stayed with her until she died. But she also lived. She also laughed. She also experienced love and community and the small joys of being alive. She built a life, even though that life was marked by what happened to her. She moved forward, even though moving forward was incredibly difficult. She survived. And that survival, that determination to keep going, that's her real legacy. Not just the medical knowledge that came from her case, not just the safety protocols that came from her experience, but the fact that she kept living, that she refused to let that experience completely define and destroy her, that she found a way to move forward despite everything. That's Essie Dunbar, the woman who came back from the dead, the woman who was buried alive and survived, the woman whose story continues to echo across more than a century. the woman who reminds us that death isn't always what we think it is, that consciousness can exist in strange places, that humans are far more resilient than we give them credit for, and that sometimes the most important survival is the psychological one, the survival of the spirit. The determination to keep living even after living has become incredibly difficult.